So
Okay.
what I do is, you've got the first bits, Anna,
Yeah.
through to ethnomusicology, through to my three recent books. And then rather than go into the songs of great leaders, I'll do the learning to perform. And then go into songs of great leaders.
Okay, yep. So then for the slides that your biomusicality slides, I'll call them, the learn to perform bit, that I think would be best done. I'll do that with spoken translation, and then we can zip through the songs for great leaders at the end, because that's prepared in written translation.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
So do you want me to pause so that you can do translation?
Yeah, so there, I've got your script. So if you follow your script as a rough guideline for where to pause, I'll do the translations accordingly. I think that should be fine.
That's only in the learning to perform. So the rest of it, you don't need me to pause, just
I don't need you to pause, no. Just speak fine, yeah.
Well, actually, if you prefer then, we'll just keep it as you've got it, if you like. I can just move it back.
No, I think, the flow of it does make sense that way around. I think we can, it's not a problem.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
So I'll just remember from 16 onwards to give you time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that'd be great. And yeah, just so we don't disturb the flow too much, I'll shorten the content slightly, but I'll make sure that enough of the general sort of meaning of the discussion comes across.
So maybe I'll do it one by one in terms of the PowerPoint slides. I'll give you one PowerPoint slide like that one. I'll read it through and then pause for you to do your bit.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Etc. Okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, so I can come out and share screen. Right. So, do we need to check that my PowerPoint comes up on your screen there?
It came up fine just now, so.
Okay. Did it come up on the Seoul대 lecture theatre?
서울대 강의실 쪽에 확인 부탁드립니다. 저기서도 PPT 잘 보이나요?
네, 저희는 PPT 잘 보입니다. 지금은 안 보이지만 아까는 잘 보였어요.
네네, 아까. 네, 알겠어요. Okay.
Are you well? Everybody well? Yeah. And are you still in lockdown or back to face-to-face teaching?
We're moving back to face-to-face lately. It's still kind of a bit up in the air. There's a certain amount of people negotiating for themselves who prefers in person and who prefers to stay online. But that's kind of currently in the transition phase there.
Right, yes. Okay. If I can keep my voice going.
At 5, I will start at first. 이용식 선생님 들어와 주셔서 정말 감사드립니다. 너무 감사해요.
이용식 선생님.
Hi kids.
반갑습니다. Hi, hello. Nice to see you.
My students.
Okay. 반갑습니다.
I can see a couple of my ethnomusicology students have come in too, so that's nice to see. Yeah, Keith, just as a heads up, obviously we'll have Ijung's greetings first. I'll do them, since they're in Korean, I'll do them once in English as well, just for the global audience amongst us. I mean, obviously this is being live streamed on YouTube at the same time as well.
Wow.
So we'll do it once, we'll do it once in Korean, once in English, and then it's over to you. And then, like I said, the translation will remain in the chat up until the learning to perform section.
Okay, no problems. And I see Jan Kreuzenberg has joined us. So welcome, Jan.
I think he can't hear you yet.
No.
The audio seems to still be connecting.
Hi, Jan. Yes, you can hear me, can't you? Jan Kreuzenberg, nice to see you.
Great to see you. Hi,
Nice
Anna.
to see you.
Hello.
Hello. Okay, then I will start. Yes.
Okay.
안녕하세요. 저는 서울대학교 음악대학 동양음악연구소 소장 이지영입니다. 이렇게 온라인상에서 여러분들을 만나게 되어 대단히 반갑습니다. 참여해 주신 여러분들에게 감사의 인사를 드립니다. 세계는 지금 코로나19로 매우 어려운 상황을 맞이하고 있습니다. 이러한 어려움은 우리 사회의 각 분야에 많은 영향을 미치고 있습니다. 그러나 이러한 변화는 또한 우리에게 새로운 시도를 할 수 있는 기회를 주기도 할 것입니다. 우리는 실제로 만나지는 못하지만 온라인상에서 더욱더 자주 또 훨씬 더 용이한 방법으로 여러 학문적 교류를 할 수 있을 것입니다.
Hello, my name is Lee Ji-young. I'm a professor at Seoul National University Department of Music, and I'm in charge of the Asian Music Research Center. I'm very glad to meet all of you online like this. Thank you very much for joining us. Obviously, at the moment in the world, it's a difficult situation with Corona and so on, but at the same time, it's also an opportunity to try out new things. And so even though we can't meet in person, this is a great opportunity for us to meet online, to have various academic exchanges through this medium as well.
동양음악연구소에서는 오늘 제1회 가교를 세우다 국제 인류음악학 교류 세미나 시리즈를 시작합니다. 이 시리즈는 동양음악연구소의 프로젝트 기획으로 시작하는 강연 프로그램입니다. 매년 상반기와 하반기에 나누어 상반기에는 한국 학자를 외국에 소개하고 또 하반기에는 외국 학자를 한국에 소개하는 기획 프로그램으로 한국과 외국의 학문적 교류를 추진합니다. 이 프로그램은 이후에도 지속적으로 추진할 계획이며 많은 관심 부탁드립니다.
The Asian Music Research Center is starting its first international exchange seminar today. It's an international ethnomusicology exchange seminar, and it's going to be a series that we are planning to take into effect from now on. In this series, at the first half of each year, we will be introducing a Korean scholar to the world. And in the second half of the year, we will be introducing an overseas scholar to a Korean audience. In this way, we will hope to have various academic exchanges between Korea and the international scene. As this program is going to be continuing in the future, we ask for lots of interest and participation in the future as well.
오늘은 그 첫 번째로 평생 한국 음악을 연구하며 한국인보다도 더 한국 음악을 사랑하시는 영국의 민족음악학자 키스 하워드 교수님을 모시고 음악학에서 민족음악학에 이르기까지 나는 왜 민족음악학자가 되었고 왜 한국음악에 대한 연구에 집중하기로 결심하였는가 라는 주제로 평생 한국음악 연구에 대한 진중한 생각을 듣는 시간입니다.
Today, in our first session, we're going to be listening to the talk of Keith Howard, who's researched Korean music for a very long time and knows much more about Korean music than many Koreans do. In this talk, we're going to be listening to how he started from musicology and ended up in ethnomusicology, why he now works as an ethnomusicologist, and how I decided to research Korean music.
키사워드 교수님.
Asian Music Research Society was able to welcome him to talk for us today. Thank you very much for joining us. And I, Annie Yates Liu, will be taking charge of translation today. A note on translation, we will be doing this presentation in English with translation in Korean in the chat discussion area, as well as spoken as well for the questions later at the end. 혹시 영어 좀 자신감이 없으신 분이 계시면 채팅방에서 한국어 번역을 확인하실 수 있습니다. 감사합니다.
Okay, well, thank you everybody. It's a great honor to be invited to give this lecture, which is a personal history really, which is even more of an honor. So thank you very much and thank you for attending. And let's just see how it goes. So I'm going to share my screen here. Host has disabled the host needs to give me permission to share my screen.
공유 부탁드립니다. 그 공유할 수 있게 하우드 교수님 지금 필요하십니다. You should be able to do it now, Keith.
Yes, indeed. So you can hopefully see that. So I'm going to start with, this is a personal account, so why I chose ethnomusicology for my PhD, and then how I developed my career as an ethnomusicologist. You have some photographs here from various times in my life. You can see that I don't really look the same as I did 30 years ago today, but on the top left, playing Kein Chango Nori, as I'd learned it from Kim Byung-sop back in the 1980s, lecturing more recently to adults, teaching children Samul Nori, Chango Panju, so accompanying Sanjo, played there by Kim Hee-son Sonzengin, and in the bottom right, attending a Samul Nori Kyorugi in Seoul. So various things going on there. Now, the main reason I came to Seoul first in 1981 was because I wanted to research how people use music, how it's part of their lives. And this was the reason I changed my major from Western music studies, Soyang-um악학 or um악학, to ethnomusicology, often in Korean known as 음악인류학. Why ethnomusicology? Well, there's two reasons. The first reason is that my first degree, my BA honours degree, was in Western music from Huddersfield University. And I'd studied musicology, music performance, and composition. In musicology, I wrote a thesis on the French composer Gabriel Fauré, and was a member of the French Association promoting his music, Les Amis de Gabriel Fauré. In music performance, I have a conservatoire diploma for piano performance, as some of you know. I was a singer, an orchestral clarinetist, and I still am a church organist. Here where I live, I play around actually 4 churches rather than 1. And then as a composer, I won a major composition prize while I was still a BA student. Continuing from there, having graduated from my BA, I decided to do an MA, Soxa, in composition. And for that, I was sponsored by the Vaughan Williams Trust, named after the English composer, Ralph Vaughan Williams. And I studied at Durham University. So in Huddersfield, I'd studied with the late Harold Truscott, bottom right photograph. And at Durham, I studied with the Australian David Lumsday. You can see a couple of my scores at the top there. But I recognized a problem. And the problem was that interest in Western art music or classical music is declining. And new Western style compositions are not listened to by the general public. So if I spent hundreds of hours writing a new piece, it would usually only be performed once for a small audience. It seemed difficult to justify that. Now, just to illustrate the sort of composition I was producing, particularly at Durham, here's an excerpt of one piece. It's the Eyes of Bosh. I'll start it and then just talk about it. So it's based on the picture you see there, which is Hieronymus Bosch's The Garden of Earthly Delights. It's a central panel of his triptych, really. It's an electronic piece, but sort of music concrete. And I play this partly because one of the people I met at Seoul National University when I was first there, who used to have an office very close to the Asian Music Research Center, was Kang Sok-hee, sadly died last year. And Kang Sok-hee, of course, introduced electronic music to Korea for the first time. Not this piece, of course.
Keith, if I can interrupt you for a minute, Might it be possible when you're doing the screen sharing that you share the audio at the same time? I think at the moment the audio isn't being transmitted properly. So you might have to close the screen sharing and try that again in order to get the audio to be transmitted.
Okay, I think the easiest way to do is to just go on at that point.
Okay, just in case you've got other audio material coming out later.
No, I will try not to use audio material in that case. I'm not quite sure what's happening there, but let's not worry at the moment. Okay, so that was a piece I was particularly interested in sharing that because of the connection to Kang Sok-hee and in his honor. So the first reason was basically composing was something that spent you spent many hundreds of hours writing a piece, but very few people wanted to listen to it in my society. The second reason why I chose ethnomusicology came because, like many music graduates, I trained to become a school teacher. And here in the UK and in many parts of the world, UK children don't really like their school music classes. Few of them take the upper school exams in music, that's GCSE at age 16 and A-level or BTEC at age 18. Those exams are often needed if you want to enter university to study music. But despite this, I noticed that children left school music classes and turned on, in the 1980s, their Walkmans, their iPods, their computers. So children want music, but they don't want to be taught music. They want to consume music, they want to listen to it, but they don't want to learn to perform music. Few children these days practice and learn instruments. So those are the two reasons why I chose ethnomusicology: composition and school music teaching, and not being satisfied with either of them. So I wanted to switch to ethnomusicology to research how people use music as part of their daily life. How did I find out about ethnomusicology? Well, I've always believed that music of the people should be distinguished from music for the people. So music of the people is music learnt, performed, sung, created. Music for the people is music consumed through recordings, broadcasts, and as audience members who listen to others make music. And we've moved in my society from one to the other, from music of the people to music for the people. So in 1981, to become an ethnomusicologist, and with my musicology background, I realized I needed first to learn anthropology, and within that methodology fieldwork, and second, to research a music culture distant from my own. Why a music culture distant from my own? Because I needed, well, my own culture, I'd experienced it. I'm subjective. I have my own ideas about it. It's difficult for me to be objective, to stand outside it and assess things. So I wanted to go to somewhere that I didn't know, somewhere distant. And why did I need anthropology? Because I needed to study how people use music, not the music itself, or less the music itself, more how people use it. So I chose to study for my PhD at Queen's University of Belfast, supervised by John Blacking, whose photograph you can see here. And he was the head of an anthropology department. I chose John Blacking partly because I found my understandings of music matched those in Blacking's famous book, How Musical is Man, pictured there from 1973. So why did I decide to research Korean music? Well, this is not necessarily what you're going to expect, but the first point is that too many ethnomusicologists study African or Indian, South Asian music, or perhaps Indonesian music, gamelan. And I thought I needed to be in some way different. I wanted to be different partly to try to get a job after my PhD. And at that time, I discovered there were only 3 foreign scholars studying Korean music: Robert Provine, Keith Pratt, and Jonathan Condit. Now, Robert Provine, as many of you know, primarily studies music in the, let's say, 15th century, that sort of period, and the Sejong and post-Sejong era, going up to Akak Kwebom. Chonga. Keith Pratt was a professor of Chinese, actually at the University of Durham, and his interest was in the exchanges of art, court music, ritual court music, in the 12th century onwards with China. And Jonathan Condit had done his PhD again on music in the 15th century. So those three scholars were all looking at music in the past. For me to understand how people use music, I wanted to look at music in the present. And I felt there was a gap there in Western knowledge about Korean music. Now, Robert Provine had joined Durham. Keith Pratt was at Durham when I did my MA in composition at Durham, so I met them. Now, I knew that Korea was rapidly developing, and that meant that I could study old music, things like minyo, pongmul, museogumak, folk songs, bands, percussion bands, shaman music, and also new music, K-pop, chakgok, soyangumak, so Western music, composition and K-pop, but also samonori and changjak-kugak, the genres that were emerging at that time. I could study both, and that was excellent if I wanted to look at this difference between music of the people and music for the people. So in 1979, I volunteered as a student helper at the Durham Oriental Music Festival. And that year, Korean musicians were present, and I was asked to assist musicians from the National Kugak Center, Kugakwan, and the Seoul National Professor, Han Man-young. That was really useful for me to hear and talk to people. And in those days, you have to remember that very few people in my country, in Britain, knew much about Korea except for memories. And they were memories primarily of the dreadful Korean War, which was still being memorialized on TV through the US program MASH. I, though, had a different memory, because when I was 16, a school teacher had introduced me to St. Peter's Convent in Woking, near where I grew up. And the sisterhood there had been founded in 1861. You can see some of them in recent years, top right. And in 1892, the sisters had been invited by the then Anglican Bishop of Korea, Charles Korff, the Anglicans or Episcopalians, Songgonghae to you Koreans. They'd been invited to help with nursing and to run an orphanage in Korea. And in fact, one sister, Mary Claire, died in the first year of the Korean War. She was captured and marched northwards by North Korean forces. I remembered that. So when I arrived in Korea first in 1981, I brought presents from St. Peter's nuns in England to their Korean counterparts. The middle picture on the right, the Society of the Holy Cross, which still exists, and it operates near Deoksu-gong, for those of you who are Koreans, just next to an old KCIA building, Hanggibu building. Now, I was also fortunate that during my first visit to Seoul in 1981, the International Council for Traditional Music, ICTM, formerly IFMC, held its conference in Seoul. It was the first time the ICTM or IFMC had been to East Asia. And Han Man-young Sonsengnim asked me to edit papers of Korean scholars and help the scholars prepare to give their papers in English. And those scholars included Lee Hae-gu, Chang Sa-hun, Lee Chae-suk, Kim Chong-ja, Kwon Ho-sung, and Lee Sung-chul. Now that was immensely valuable because I was able to meet major scholars of Korean music. Now my career as an ethnomusicologist can actually be seen through my publications. So after my PhD, obviously I've kept going with Korean research, but I've broadened from there. So 2 NBs. Number 1, my research and publications don't just focus on Korean music, but includes research on Thailand, Nepal, Siberia, Zimbabwe, and Kyrgyzstan. And second, I'm an anthropologist as well as a musicologist, ethnomusicologist. My PhD was in a department of anthropology. Hence, my publications are not all on musical topics. That's quite typical of ethnomusicologists abroad, where we can't just teach about one music. We have to be broader than that. So here are some of my books. If we just look along the top line, you can see North Korea, Presence Through Sound, Music and Place in East Asia, and edited text. A book on Korean Kaegum Sanjo, with Professor Lee Jae-suk, co-writing, then a book on Hallyu, the Korea Wave, co-edited with Gilsung Park at Korea University, and Nissim Otmazgin from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, an edited book on Korean shamanism. The first book in English documenting the oral testimonies of comfort women, Chongshinde. The first book in English, surprisingly, an edited book on pop music, but the first in English on pop music in Korea. Then the second line, the Kyrgyz Menace, a co-written book with the Kyrgyz Menace epic storyteller, Sapabek Kazmanbetov. The book that came from my PhD, Banned Songs and Shamanistic Rituals. A book on preserving Korean music, so intangible cultural properties, Muyong Munaje. A book on creating Korean music, so from preservation to developing and sustaining, with a picture of Hwang Byung-gi, the very well-known Kayagum player who died recently. A book for schools, co-edited with Susan Pears and Tessa English. A little book from Oxford University Press on Korean musical instruments. My book co-written with Chatwa Dutiro on Zimbabwean umbira music. Then at the bottom row, left, the book I wrote for the British government for the official book for Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth II's state visit to Korea in 1999. A book on music as intangible cultural heritage in East Asia, edited with many of my colleagues. The second version of my practical guide, Korean Musical Instruments, a Practical Guide, published by Min Seok-won in Seoul in 2015. My book on Samulnori, an edited book on music and ritual, an edited book on shamans, and finally, something on world music and the changing music industry. So very varied. From there, I want to talk about what ethnomusicology is. This is a personal take. And the first point to say there is that American ethnomusicologists are keen to offer definitions, but we Europeans are much less keen. From the American stable, you could pick up Ruth Stone's theory for ethnomusicology in 2008, pictured on the left. That outlines many of the elements in ethnomusicology, but it does so by identifying those she considers key scholars. Unfortunately, that means that many scholars and many approaches are omitted. Timothy Rice has written 2 recent books that try hard to define ethnomusicology, Modeling Ethnomusicology in 2017, and Transforming Ethnomusicology, Methodologies, Institutional Structures and Policies from this year. But these texts and many other accounts remain very heavily focused on North America. The Society for Ethnomusicology also is heavily focused on North America, and actually his only non-American resident president was John Blacking, my PhD supervisor. He was president from 1981 to 1983, and he argued that future SEM, Society for Ethnomusicology presidents, must be North American. But ethnomusicology is not just what is taught and studied in North America. John Blacking actually founded a European seminar in ethnomusicology, and that keeps going. There is more folk music, in inverted commas, but more regional and various approaches to do with West Europe, East Europe, and Russia. And the ESEM, the European seminar, is actually close to the International Council for Traditional Music, which was established in London in 1949, partly by Vaughan Williams. And that brings together scholars from around the world. So if we take a fairly simple definition of ethnomusicology, such as ethnomusicology is the study of music in culture, or as some like Tony Seeger would say, the study of music as culture, ethnomusicology is a very broad field, and it includes many different approaches. One of those approaches it should include is Korean musicology, Kugakak. It doesn't have to be the same approach as American ethnomusicology in Korea. Let me take those definitions a little bit further. John Blacking, in his How Musical is Man, wrote that all men are musical. Music is a species-specific attribute of man. So we should be studying music across the world, everywhere in the world. Michael Spitzer this year, in his The Musical Human, A History of Life on Earth, has written that music is more human than language. It predates language. If you like, that development of music is linked to bipedalism, walking on two legs, our hyoid bones, the bones that allow us to sing and vocalize, the growth of our brains that allow control of articulation, and our manual dexterity that allows us to build tools and instruments. So why do we need ethnomusicology? Well, Western music and the Western music industry doesn't represent the totality of music. And music cannot be isolated, or should not be isolated, from the culture in which it develops and is practiced. So we need more than Western musicology. Now, one of the almost paradigms of ethnomusicology is fieldwork, spending an extended period of time studying alongside people in the musical culture. That has characterized a lot of ethnomusicology, but it's changing. So let's not define ethnomusicology just as fieldwork, because why should fieldwork need to study elsewhere? Why can't it be done online using your computer? Why can't it be local? Why does fieldwork for a PhD mean, and I know a lot of Koreans are concerned about this, why does fieldwork mean that the foreigner, rather than the local, becomes the expert? If you like, why should I, as somebody living thousands of miles away from Korea, be considered the expert rather than those of you studying and working in Korea? Ultimately, ethnomusicology develops and changes over time. And so definitions need to be very broad to accommodate many different approaches or accept that change happens. So there's an old definition of folk music, which came from the IFMC, the International Folk Music Council, which became the International Council for Traditional Music, holding its conference in Seoul in 1981. There's the definition, and I put a line through it because it doesn't work anymore. Folk music is the product of a music tradition that has evolved through the process of oral transmission. The factors that shape the tradition, let's skip those, but there are three. And the final bit, the term does not cover composed popular music. That doesn't account for what ethnomusicologists do today. And in fact, by 1981, when the International Folk Music Council held its conference at the Schiller Hotel there in Seoul to become the ICTM, the International Council for Traditional Music, they recognized that definition was no longer tenable. Many ethnomusicologists studied more than folk music. And in Korea, that would include Pansori, Sanjo, Ark, and Chongak. So the IFMC renamed itself as the International Council for Traditional Music. But traditional, you can see I put a line through this, it's also a problematic term. So the ICTM, since 2017, has been attempting to change its name again. In Britain, we went through the same thing. In Britain, the Association of Ethnomusicologists was called the IFMC UK chapter. And in 1981, after the conference in Seoul, it became the ICTM UK chapter. That didn't work very well. So in 1996, it became the British Forum for Ethnomusicology. And that's the parent organization behind the journal Ethnomusicology Forum. Clearly today, folk and traditional are only part of what ethnomusicologists study, because many ethnomusicologists study pop music, including, of course, K-pop and many other things. Now, if I just go back to my PhD fieldwork, it's very clear that ethnomusicology must develop and change over time. Now, my primary fieldwork site for my PhD fieldwork was Jeonnamdo, Chindo, so the island of Chindo off the southwest of Korea. And these scenes that you can see here were every day in the early 1980s, but today they're memories. I could not study the same music and culture in Chindo today. Just quickly, on the left, you have making lava, kim, or using an A-frame, washing clothes in a stream. We have a shaman ritual ceremony, shikimkut. needless to say, all the musicians you can see there and the shamans have since died. An old style funeral, a chobun, a straw house, which incurred the second burial practice involved in, say, tashiregi. Second burials were common in Ming China, and they extended down into Southeast Asia, into Indonesia, where until recently you could find something like this. So the bones of the dead were laid on stones underneath a straw house for 3 years. Then a New Year's Nongak Pungmo performance, a village performance. And finally, a village Tutuluri spirit pole, a changsung, but here in stone. I think that's the village of Tokbyong. So things change. And you can also see in my 3 most recent books how diverse and multifaceted ethnomusicology can be. So on the left, and I'll come back to this later, my book on North Korean music and dance, then an edited book with Catherine Ingram from Sydney University, Presence Through Sound, Music and Place in East Asia. And the photograph there is of indigenous Taiwanese children. And on the right, transcultural fandom and the globalization of Hallyu. So Korea Wave. Looking at Korea Wave across the world rather than just in Korea. Now, in the next section, I'm going to talk about learning to perform, which has become a very common methodology in ethnomusicology. And after each slide, I'm going to pause while Anna translates. So ethnomusicologists often learn to perform the music they're researching. I did. And this is a methodology that began with Mantelhood's concept of bimusicality, which he began when he introduced UCLA students in Los Angeles to Indonesian gamelan. He wrote about it in 1960, most recently in 1995. What is bimusical or musicality? It's, to Mantelhood, a means of understanding the music of another culture, that is, accessing the music of other. And Hood contended that learning to perform challenged the known. The experiences students had of musicking from their training in, for example, classical piano or violin, well, they needed to reassess that, including their mental and physical assumptions and practices about music when learning a different music. Bimusical quickly became a hook on which to hang much more. It was knowledge acquisition, cultural and ethnic advocacy, aesthetic and artistic pluralism, and access during fieldwork to musicians to be able to play alongside musicians. There's a quote there that I'll just miss out, you can read it, but over to Anna for a quick translation.
네, 살짝 원래 계획된 내용과 달라지면서 제가 이 부분을 지금 말로 번역하겠습니다. 그래서 여기서 인류음악학에서 아주 중요한 부분이 뭐냐면 보통은 개념적으로 모든 인류음악학자들이 이 연구하는 음악도 직접 배워야 한다라는 개념이 있습니다. 이 개념은 이 Mantelhood의 bimusicality, 즉 이중 음악성이란 개념에서 나왔는데 처음에서 UCLA 학생들한테 인도네시아 가멜란이란 장르를 소개하면서 만들어진 개념인데 기본적으로 이렇게 이 음악을 다른 문화의 음악을 배우면서 개인이 이미 속히는 좀 익숙해지는 그런 음악적인 습관, 배우는 과정 등등 다시 한번 생각하게 만드는 그런 과정이 될 수 있다고 합니다. 그래서 이 이중 음악성을 통해 다른 지식을 좀 더 잘 접근할 수 있게 되는 거고, 뭐 음악적의 다양성, 뭐 미학적, 예술적의 다양성, 그리고 이 현장 연구 진행하면서 이 음악가들과의 접근이 더 쉬워지는 과정도 또한 이 이중 음악성이라고 할 수 있습니다. Over to you, Pete.
Thank you. So bimusicality, and these days polymusicality, is all about breaking barriers between scholarship and performance. It's actually part of the post-World War II zeitgeist, how we should appreciate and respect cultural difference, not just study it, but to appreciate it, we may need to do it. And by the 1980s, some ethnomusicologists became professional performers. At the top there is Andre Gutzwiller. And then Jean During in the middle, on the right, playing makam. Others have learnt, say, Indian music, or the bottom pictures are two Indonesian gamelan performance groups. The large picture is Lila Chita Gamelan, who I've produced a CD for. Actually, by the 1980s, though, Western musicians were becoming polycultural. So somebody who used to just play the classical piano probably plays jazz piano, pop music on the piano as well. And perhaps also, in their spare time or whatever, plays a bit of Indonesian gamelan as well. Also, the ethnomusicologists have become expected in many universities to run performance courses in, say, Balinese and Javanese gamelan, African drumming, Japanese taiko, Korean samalnori, Zimbabwean and bira, whatever it is. It's part of what we do. One thing to take home from this is that the division between performers and musicologists or ethnomusicologists is breaking down. So that division between, say, a DMA and a PhD is breaking down. Anna.
네, 여기서 이중 음악성이란 것이 제2차 세계대전이 끝난 다음에 이 분위기에 맞게 좀 다양한 문화를 존중하고 이렇게 같이 있어야 한다라는 개념에서 일어났는데 가면서 좀 더 깊어지는 것도 확인할 수 있습니다. 그래서 80년대부터 인류음악학자가 이렇게 연구용으로만 이렇게 배우는 것보다 정말 전문적으로 연주자가 되는 경우가 있는데 여러 가지 여기서 사진을 볼 수도 있고 그리고 갈수록 사실은 서양 음악가들이 이렇게 다문화적으로 이렇게 활동하고 있다라는 것을 또 같이 확인할 수 있습니다. 네, 그래서 이 상에도 슬슬 이 이중음악성의 이 자리가 잡으면서 인류음악학자들이 본인 학교에서도 이런 여러 가지 연주 수업까지 운행하는 것이 좀 더 평범해지면서 뭐 이렇게 가멜란이나 아프리카 드럼, 일본 드럼, 한국 사물놀이, 뭐 짐바브웨 음악까지 이렇게 소개하는 경우가 많고 직접 연주해야 하는 것이 많아지면서 이 연주자와 연구가 사이에 있었던 갈등이 슬슬 무너지고 있고 좀 더 이렇게 구분하기가 어려워지는 상황도 확인할 수 있습니다. Over to you, Keith.
Thank you. So let's turn to me. So how I learnt Chango Nori from Kim Byung-sok. On my first day in Seoul in 1981, I spoke very little Korean, but I had the address of Kim Byung-sok's studio written down, so I asked the taxi driver to deliver me to the door of his studio. I spoke virtually zero Korean, so I signed to Kim that I wanted him to teach me the Chango. We agreed a fee. He wrote a figure on a board for a month lessons, 6 days per week. My first lesson started with Kim tying a drum to me with a sash. He showed me how to hold the two sticks, the yolche whip-like stick in my right hand and the kungulche or kungche mallet-like stick in my left. He began to teach me karak, single rhythmic patterns, building them into short motifs, then into longer and longer segments of his 15-minute piece. He stood before me as a mirror, hence he held his sticks in the opposite hands to me, to demonstrate and guide. There was no discussion or explanation. He would tell me to repeat each pattern until he was satisfied, not just with the musical elements, but with my body posture, my foot positions, and more. And I should say there was no discussion or explanation expected with Korean students. You did what he showed you and did not ask. So once I had about 25 karak, the individual patterns, other students would join sometimes. And after class, I'd move to a second room to practice with other students. And after 2 weeks, each lesson ended with me performing what I'd learnt on my own as the next student arrived. Anna.
네, 지금은 본인의 이렇게 장고놀이 배우는 과정을 좀 살펴보겠습니다. 그래서 서울에 도착한 전날 1981년에 이렇게 아무 한국말 잘 못하고 그냥 이 주소가 종이에 적혀 있는 걸로 그 김병섭 집까지 이렇게 택시 타면서 갔는데 한국말을 못해서 손으로 이렇게 신호를 주면서 장구 배우고 싶다고 그리고 뭐 글씨로 이렇게 뭐 이렇게 한 달 동안 이렇게 배우겠다고 이렇게 다 그 레슨비도 이렇게 정하고 그래서 바로 시작하는 것은 김병섭 선생님이 이렇게 악기를 사진을 확인하신 대로 이렇게 몸에 이렇게 메고 그다음에 열체를 오른손에 어떻게 잡고 궁체를 왼손에 어떻게 잡고 천천히 하나하나씩 가락을 가르쳐 주면서 슬슬 길어지면서 이 완성된 작품이 나올 때까지 가르치는데 이 가르치는 방식이 어떠냐면 거울처럼 그래서 손이 바꾸면서 뭐 열체는 왼손에 잡고 뭐 그런 식으로 하면서 보여주면서 이렇게 안내해 주는 건데 이 수업 과정에서 뭐 이렇게 토론이나 설명 같은 것이 없었어요. 그냥 이렇게 만족할 때까지 다시 하란 그런 방법으로 가르치셨는데 이것은 이 피는 것만 아니고 몸을 어떻게 하는지 발이 어떻게 되는지 이 여러 가지 방법을 포함해서 완벽하게 해야 다음 부분으로 넘어가는 건데 이것이 뭐 언어적 제한 때문에 하는 것이 아니었고 한국 학생들과 마찬가지 아무 토론 없이 아무 설명 없이 수업 진행하는 방식이었습니다. 그래서 가락을 한 25개 배운 다음에 다른 학생들도 합류했고 수업이 끝나고 이 다른 방에 가면서 이 학생들과 같이 연습하는 방법이 있었고 한 2주가 지난 다음에 매번 레슨이 끝나는 것이 무엇이냐면 그때 배웠던 것을 혼자서 보여주면서 이 다른 학생이 들어오는 과정에 이렇게 혼자서 보여주는 방식으로 진행했습니다.
Now, actually, there are some interesting things here. Kim Byung-sop, he never used notation in class, and he didn't allow students to use it when learning with him. Notations, though, have been made by, say, Robert Provine, most recently in Korea by Cho Mi-yeon, but by others as well. And Kim's teaching actually fits a common rote learning method that we find in many parts of the world. It's outlined, for instance, by Mantle Hood back in 1971 and by William Malm in 86. Kim Byung-sop also provided motivation and reward. And most interestingly there, after 2 weeks of learning from him, Kim Byung-sop received a telephone call. He looked at me, he smiled, he spoke to the unseen person on the phone, and he'd booked me to perform on MBC TV, along with Yoon Gwan. Then, as I ended my initial 6-week study in 1981, the annual KBS TV music contest for foreigners was held, and I performed, very inadequately, but I carried off the top award. Then when I returned to Korea in 1982 and 1983, Kim took me to many gigs in Seoul and North Cholla to perform with him. In 1982, I also learned melodic instruments using Korean notation, not Western notation, because I needed to learn the Korean way. So I learned Haegum with Yoon Chang-gu, Kayagum with Om Hae-gyong, Minyo, and Shijo from Lee Yang-gyo. So that's the 2-string fiddle, the 12-string zither, folk songs, and Shijo sort of lyric songs. And in the UK, I've taught Chango Nori and Samul Nori since 1988. And you can see a couple of pictures of some of my students.
네, 그래서 여기 이어가면서 추가적인 내용인데 김병석 선생님께서 처음부터 이렇게 수업 중에서 악보를 쓰지 않으셨고 다른 학생들한테도 쓰게 하면 안 된다고 하시면서 이렇게 가르치셨는데 사실은 뭐 다른 곳에 뭐 장고놀이에 대한 악보가 존재하긴 합니다. 뭐 로버트 프로바인이나 조면 같은 학자들이 이런 악보를 만들었는데 이 김병석 선생님의 방법은 좀 더 이 구전 교육으로 이런 방식으로 이어갔는데 이것도 많은 인류 음악학자들이 다른 문화에서도 확인한 바 있습니다. 이어가면서 이 수업은 계속 이 배우는 과정만 아니었고 뭐 몇 주 지나가면서 갑자기 전화 오면서 이렇게 MBC TV에 공연하게 되었고 그 1981년에 이 첫 수업 과정이 끝난 다음에 KBS TV에서 이렇게 외국인을 위한 그 음악 대회가 있었는데 저기서 뭐 부족했지만 공연을 하면서 결국은 대상을 받았다는 기억도 있습니다. 다음번에 한국에 다시 돌아오면서 이건 1982년, 83년 때였는데 뭐 서울이나 전라북도에서 돌아다니면서 공연도 많이 했던 기억이 있습니다. 그리고 1982년부터 슬슬 다른 선율 악기도 배우기 시작했는데 이것은 이렇게 서양 악보는 아니고 한국 악보, 즉 정감보를 사용하면서 뭐 윤창구 선생님께 해금을 배웠고 엄유경 선생님께 가야금 배웠고 이양교 선생님께 민요, 시조도 배웠고 그리고 1988년 때부터 장구놀이와 서문놀이를 영국에서 가르친 바가 있습니다.
Thank you, Anna. Now, from this point, we go back to the translations in the chat, I think, rather than stopping at each point. So please, my Korean colleagues, look at your chat. So I'm going to just briefly look at my most recent book, Songs for Great Leaders, Ideology and Creativity in North Korean Music and Dance, from Oxford University Press last year, to ask what can we learn about ethnomusicology from this book, and how can ethnomusicology be done when fieldwork and traditional ethnomusicology, if you like, is restricted. So the book has 9 chapters. It's a sort of art structure. So the first chapter is about early songs, the 1945s through the 1970s, and discusses composers such as Kim Won-gyun, Ri Myeon-sang, Ri Kon-woo, Kim Sun-nam, Kim Ok-song, An Ki-young, and more. Then there are 2 chapters about instruments, Keryang-aki. Then 3 chapters about opera, Hyungmyeong-kaguk, so revolutionary opera, and ideology, and an analysis of some of the music. Chapter 7 is about mass spectacles and dance. For dance, looking in particular at Chaesung-hee and at the dance notation, Chamo Pyogibo, which also works for mass spectacle notation. Chapter 8 is about composers and composing the nation. So looking in particular at Shin-do-son, Cho Gil-sok, Yunisang, and in terms of Yunisang at the films. There are 4 films about him in the Minjokgwa Unmyeong series, The Nation and Destiny. And finally, chapter 9 looks at pop songs, if you like, in North Korea, from Pochombo and Wang Jae-sam through to Moranbong and what's going on today. Now, there are problems with researching in North Korea that mean there is little fieldwork possibilities. Traveling to Pyongyang is restricted. Few are allowed to enter the country to carry out academic research. You can be a tourist, but to do research, more difficult. In North Korea, permission is required for every visit to every place and for every meeting. Foreigners have to have assigned guides. All meetings are monitored and recorded. Libraries only hold materials that are currently sanctioned by the state, and that means there's no access to forbidden materials, typically materials before the 1970s, and there's no possibility of private study. Books, audios, video recordings, they're not freely available. And foreigners, well, universities can rarely copy materials without getting permission, and foreigners can only buy materials, usually, in hotel stores. Now, I visited and researched in North Korea in 1992, sponsored by the Untitled I'd worked with the Korean composer Yunisang in Berlin and in Britain. And again, I went in 2000 when the UK, along with many EU states, were establishing diplomatic relations with North Korea. And I've since regularly met DPRK scholars and musicians in conferences, concerts, and through diplomatic missions. Interviews, live, lots of things going on there. So it's not just the fieldwork there. This means that much collecting and studying materials on North Korea has to be done outside North Korea. It's becoming easier in South Korea to do it, but until recently, the national security law meant it was difficult to access North Korean materials. The archive that's just opened its doors at the National Gugak Center, of course, is absolutely wonderful. In Europe and the USA, there are reasonable libraries, but they're patchy, they're incomplete. Post-1975, they're pretty poor because the mid-1970s and late 1970s saw economic sanctions when North Korea didn't pay its debts to Western banks, and that made getting materials from North Korea very difficult. Unfortunately, though, 1975 is when the comprehensive text on literary art theory, Munyeiriron, was published. And that means that earlier materials often reflect different ideology and practice to those of today. There are libraries and archives in China and Japan, but access is restricted to most of them. And in fact, some are private, but when I first tried to get materials from the university in Yanji, Rondenda학교, I was rebuffed with the comment, "We've already given our materials to others. Why should we give them again?" And anything online, of course, about North Korea does need careful interpretation and checking. So it's challenging. Very briefly, we need to set North Korea up as very different to South Korea because after 1945, the two Koreas developed in different ways. North Korea was socialist, left-leaning with people's committees and labor unions. It rejected the past as backward-looking, resurrectionist flunkiest. And revolution meant moving forward. But South Korea was capitalist, initially right-leaning, and it enshrines the past, Confucianism, Buddhism, traditional music, kugak, and the preservation of cultural properties, including court and folk arts and crafts and music. So they're very different places. For that to happen, not surprisingly, North Korea looked to create its national culture from other places. The first influence was from Japan, and we shouldn't forget this. So to look at North Korea, we have to look beyond Korea. So from Japan, well, the first point here is that all recording companies during the colonial period, which operated in the Korean market, were based in Japan. So there is an obvious influence of Ryukoka on Yuhenga, or Enka on Pongchak. It can go both ways, but it's there. Both ways means it can go from Korea to Japan as well as Japan to Korea. Composers and arrangers operating in that market and operating for Japanese studios included quite a lot of Koreans. I've just put here Ri Myeon-sang, the composer who's today buried at the Revolutionary Martyrs Cemetery with guerrillas from the 1930s, from the struggle against Japan. So a very, very important person, but he was active in the Japanese recording market. Now, folk songs, minyo, were recorded by Japanese companies using professional singers because the studios were in Japan, the singers had to go to Japan. Now that meant that Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, the first two leaders of North Korea, considered that popular folk songs, Tongsok minyo in Korea, and new folk songs, Shin minyo, were the basis of national folk songs, Minjog minyo, rather than the regional folk songs, such as Sodo minyo and Namdo minyo from the regions of Korea, which are known in Korea, South Korea, sorry, as traditional songs. Again, Japanese school songs, shoka, became Korean changa, and that style has been maintained in North Korea for some songs, particularly those for children. And finally, Japanese companies in Japan and Korea in the 1930s had group calisthenics exercises for the workers, and Japanese radio broadcast music for calisthenics exercise on a daily basis. That became one of the influences on North Korea's mass performance spectacles, particularly when workers or students all performed together. We also need to look to the Soviet Union to understand North Korea's national culture. In the Soviet Union, well, actually before the Soviet Union, Vasily Andreev had developed the Russian orchestra with Russian rather than Western instruments. From the 1930s onwards, Stalin encouraged states to set up national orchestras. Not surprisingly, North Korea uses national instruments, minjogaki, in its revolutionary operas. Thinking about revolutionary operas, we need to look to the Soviet Union to see the first type of song opera that influenced those revolutionary operas. And it's Dzerzhinsky's Quiet Flows the Don from 1935. That has a clear influence in things like Pipada, The Sea of Blood from 1971 in North Korea. And the story of Pipada, of course, relates to Maxim Gorky's novel, Mother. Folk song had been used as the basis of Russian compositions for some time. there had been collections and anthologies from the late 19th century. Arakchiev, Balakirev, Chilkov, many other people, Kashin. And in North Korea too, folk songs were collected in the 1950s. And from the 1970s onwards, songs became the basis of all instrumental and orchestral compositions. Another influence on mass spectacles and mass performances comes from the Soviet Union, because they had been there under Stalin in the 1930s at Gorky Park, where they were quite carnival style, and in the Red Square as processions and parades. So it's an influence on North Korea. And of course, Soviet ideology for the arts makes its way to North Korea, socialist realism. And Juche can be considered there as a reformulation of Stalin's threefold party spirit, national character, and ideology. We also need to look to China to see how North Korea created its national culture. Again, folk songs and compositions. Shan Xinghai was one composer in China who prepared an anthology of folk song, and composers were given new texts for new folk songs. And Shan also wrote songs and cantatas with patriotic themes. We can see much the same in North Korea. And of course, some Koreans were with the Chinese communists at the Yan'an Forum in the early 1940s. Again, revolutionary operas. There are 8 model works known as revolutionary opera or revolutionary works in China. They're known as revolutionary because of communist themes. They were created before, but used during the Cultural Revolution. We can see links, if we study these, between, say, Red Detachment of Women and Sea of Blood, or White-Haired Girl with The Flower Girl, Red Lantern in China with Hotel the Forest in North Korea. We've also got national instruments to consider. This idea of keryang, improved or reformed in North Korea, and you can also find that term, of course, in South Korea, comes from Chinese, gailiang. And it was in the 1920s, down in Shanghai, that there were efforts to create national music, national instruments. And those were followed by Mao Zedong's communist instruction in 1950 and beyond 1950 for ethnic groups in China to create their national instruments and national orchestras, and to keryang them, to reform them, improve them. So that was in Jilin province amongst the Korean Chinese, before it was in North Korea. So to develop an ethnomusicology account of North Korean music and dance means looking at, well, all the things I've done so far there from other places, learning from Soviet and Chinese ideology, also looking at the speeches, the talks, the writing of leaders such as Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, studying ideology, censorship, and control. Noting that musicians and dancers had a voice in early years, so studying journals and their writings, Chosun Um악, Korean music, Chosun Yesil, Korean arts. And then recognizing that after 1975, all texts were required to adopt the same ideology and perspective. So ethnomusicology becomes very complex there. Just to finish with, as a typical ethnomusicologist, I had to broaden my research from a small Korean island, Jindo, but where to? Well, the first thing to say here is that many ethnomusicologists are known for their work in one music culture, and this reflects their publications, their seminars, their conference presentations. But is that too narrow? Because it's not what they teach. They have to teach broader things. It's not what they're known for in their universities nowadays. And if it's considered narrow to be working on one country music, one music culture, then many musicologists, Western musicologists, are equally narrow. They specialize in, say, just the Baroque, just the classical period, or just Bach, or just Mozart, or Beethoven, or the Mersey Beat and the Beatles, or Radiohead, or I suppose K-pop. So my PhD was about music, dance, and ritual in Jindo, but I've since researched other aspects of Korea: composers, shamanism, comfort women, K-pop, intangible cultural heritage, samonori, sanjo, and most recently, North Korean music and dance. Now, we need to say at this point that there are different audiences for scholarship within a culture or a region and state and outside. the culture, region, state. So my research as a British person may not focus on the same things as Korean musicologists within Korea focus on, and the importance varies depending on where you are in the world. But I've also broadened my research from Korea and taken some of the same themes to other countries and other music cultures. So I've worked on Thailand, Nepal, Zimbabwe, Kyrgyzstan, and Siberia. So I've also developed a number of collaborative projects to help get voices from musicians and dancers in other countries known in the English sort of publication and texts. So the pictures here, you can see my book with Chatwan Dutiro, Zimbabwean Umbira music on an international stage. My book with Sapabek Kazmanbetov, singing the Kyrgyz Menace, his recitations. My edited book on music as an intangible cultural heritage, which looks at Korea, Japan, China, Taiwan, so the whole of East Asia, if you like. And there's a 2 DVD set on Siberia at the center of the world, looking at Sakha-Yakutia and Buryatia. Right, I'm running out of time. So here's the postscript, my final comments. First point, ethnomusicology is today changing very fast. Partly because universities in Europe and North America are trying to escape the legacy of colonialism, which once gave people from my culture the right to become experts in other musics, including those of Korea and other East Asian states. This must no longer be right. Today, universities in East Asia, in Africa, the Middle East, and other parts of the world, and of course Seoul National University, are international. And in some ways, they're overtaking and ranking more highly than many European and North American universities. As knowledge develops, so musicology and ethnomusicology develops. But it does so in many different ways to suit the environment, the universities, the countries in which it is taught. There are 2 things to conclude with. And the first is, I have much to learn. I have to listen to the voices of my colleagues, scholars and musicians in the countries where I study. That includes you in Korea. I can't ignore your writing, your scholarship. I have to assess that and I have to use it, to learn from it and incorporate it into my research, to respect your scholarship. But you as Koreans too have a lot to learn. You need to be international in your outlook, to learn from those who have come before you, but also to strike out in new directions. Actually, you and your generation, if ethnomusicology and musicology is going to change and develop, it's you and your generation who will decide how ethnomusicology develops in the future. And at that point, I finish. So thank you very much for listening, and I will stop the sharing and come back. Right.
Thank you. 혹시 강연을 해주신 선생님께 감사를 드립니다. Thank you for. I really appreciate for the wonderful speak. Thank you, Professor Howard. And 혹시 질문 있으시면 좀 해주시겠습니까? Someone have a question?
모든 질문은 제가 동력해 드릴 수도 있으니 한국말로도 마음 편하게 질문하셔도 됩니다.
Stunned you all into silence.
Maybe if there's no other question, maybe I can ask something. Thank you very much, of course, first for this wonderful trip down memory lane, I suppose, but also highly interesting for like later generations. And also to the organizers, this program sounds really exciting. I'm looking forward to more. I would have two questions, maybe, if time allows it. So the first one, I'm very much interested in what reactions to Korean music you experienced during all those years, from like the Durham Festival, maybe, where you said there was basically not much known about Korea until today. And I mean, I'm especially interested in pre-K-pop reactions, maybe, but in any case. And the second question might, or just an idea, because you kind of hinted also to dance quite a lot. And I wonder if the concept of like ethnomusicology as focused on music, if this isn't going to change in some way to get broader, to include dance, but also maybe other forms of drama, of music theater, of storytelling. And I think ICTM, I'm not really sure, but I think they also, one suggestion to change the name, wasn't it also something like traditional music and dance into that direction? Yeah, anyway, that would be interesting to hear.
Yeah, okay, well, the second one is easy to answer. And you're absolutely right. ICTM or IFMC has always been concerned with dance as well as music. And there has always been a concern that the name doesn't include dance. And so one of the, or the likely name change will include dance within whatever that organization renames itself. Now, if you were in Europe looking at folk music, you would be aware of folk dance as well. And throughout the 20th century, with folk music collectors, there has been an overlap with folk dance collecting. In Britain, the English Folk Dance Society and the English Folk Music Society is still there in Cecil Sharp House. And folk dance was always important because something like Morris dancing, we think of the music to that, but it's dancing. So
the recording has stopped. This meeting is being recorded.
Sorry, okay. Now, the same happens in much of Europe. And so a lot of the work in, say, Romania, in Poland, in those sorts of former East European states, was on dance as much as it was on music. And distinguishing one from the other was kind of difficult within an academic organization. So not a lot has changed there. It's not that dance has become a study area. It's always been a study area, but it hasn't always been recognized in the titles of organizations. The other question about sort of reception to things Korean, yes, Korean music was hardly known in the West. Now, you can look at that in many ways historically. If we're thinking about East Asia, China was far more important to Western Europe from the 18th century onwards in terms of trade, in terms of people going there, visiting, missionaries, etc., etc. Japan was also important. And Japan as an economic sort of might from the late 19th century onwards got everybody's attention. So those two countries had far more presence in sort of British mentality, and I would say most European mentalities, than Korea did. Korea was largely neglected. It's a small place compared to China. It was also difficult for foreign traders, for missionaries to access, of course, until the late 19th century. So that legacy was that there wasn't much knowledge about Korea. And then because of the Korean War as a major conflagration in which many foreign, British, European, American military forces participated and many people died, that was a very negative legacy. In many ways, that legacy changed with things like the Olympics, the Seoul Olympics in 1988, but it took a long time. So when I started my work on Korean music, what I'd recognized was actually initially Korean rhythm was absolutely amazing. Now you can also say other types of Korean music, but for me, the rhythm was particularly important. And I couldn't find anything similar to that. I'd still say that. Now, Japanese taiko, kodo drummers and things, is very well known in the West, but the rhythm itself is nowhere near as exciting and interesting as samonori or Kim Byung-sop's Kei and Django Nori, which I learned. So Korea has some amazing things. As I started teaching things to do with Korea, so obviously students got interested, as you'd expect. And we've seen a switch in Britain where 30 years ago, studies of China and Japan were far more common than Korea. Now we see many more people studying Korea. And that's not just sudden. Many of you will know people like Simon Mills, Andrew Killick, myself, of course, Robert Provine. That's 4 people who at one point were teaching in Britain Korean music. And you're not going to find 4 people who are teaching Japanese music or Chinese music at the same time. It's become much more of a thing. And that's traditional music, that's Kuga. When we bring in Hallyu and K-pop, Korea recently has, of course, exploded in our interest, the foreign interest in Korea. And it's absolutely amazing to see. Yes, there have been times where I've been told off. I have been criticized for studying such a small, insignificant place. Occasionally, when I have been doing things for education or education policy, lesson plans, people have said, why are you doing that? You know nothing. You work on a tiny, insignificant place. You should be working on a major place. So that image is still there, sadly, amongst some people. If you were to work on the curriculum for teaching in British schools, it would be very difficult to get Korea mentioned in the curriculum. It's still much easier to get, say, India or Africa mentioned. So there's still a way to go. Okay?
혹시 또 감사합니다. 또 다른 질문 있으십니까?
If I could ask a question in the meantime, a thing that, I mean, personally, I find very interesting, and I think many of the people who are gathered here find interesting as well, this way that performance and research are becoming more and more intertwined. I mean, there's a lot of sort of discussion that's been made that initially, although everyone kind of accepted it as fact, it wasn't really being researched much from a sort of theoretical perspective, a theoretical understanding of that phenomenon. But that seems to be kind of changing a bit more these days. So I was wondering what the kind of newest developments in that area are.
Wow. The newest developments actually concern how you quantify performance as research. And everybody seems to be working on that to ensure that people who are performers can get credit in the research sort of funds, however they're organized around the world, whether it's for promotion in a university or whether it's to do with a national system, such as the British REF, Research Excellence Framework, or the Australian, whatever that's called, I can't remember now, ERA, isn't it? Excellence Research Australia. How do you get performance quantified as in some way research? Now, there's a lot of literature on this, and the literature was actually led not by music, but by theatre, drama, and fine art. So the drama overlaps into dance, if you like. So if you look, there are plenty of texts, and some of those texts are the result of workshops and committees at places such as the European Association of Conservatoires. There is quite a lot of understanding that research needs to be inclusive of what performers do. Now, if you are bringing to performance new work, new creation, then you are researching it to get it to performance. If you have discovered a notation of a piece that hasn't been played for a few hundred years, or you want to work out exactly what the court music, say, Chongak, of the 15th, 16th century sounded like, but you want to do that as performance rather than just words, then that is research. It's research to reestablish that. So performance research is a big thing. However, my point in terms of ethnomusicology is that ethnomusicologists use performance. They use performance as a research method, but they then use it as part of their teaching. So it's very much part of their makeup, and it's an expected part of their makeup in much of Europe, America, and Australasia. So that I find very fascinating. I find this idea that some ethnomusicologists become high-grade performers interesting, but I find also it fascinating that somebody like me, I'm not a very good performer of Korean music. And why should I be? Because I've studied for 1 or 2 years, whereas some of you, including some of you in the audience here, have studied for 30, 40 years, many, many more years. So all of this is very interesting. And the final point is that ethnomusicologists are starting to work with performers on collaborative projects. I've shown you my projects on Zimbabwe and Kyrgyzstan. They're collaborative with performers. But you can also find the same thing going on in, say, South America. The Meeting of Knowledges project, which was initiated by Jose Jorge de Carvalho, is now a very big thing, expanding throughout South America, but expanding beyond to other countries. And the Meeting of Knowledges is accepting academics can't write everything and don't possess all the knowledge that performers do. We need to work together. So that's a project I can send you some references for if anyone's interested. It's very fascinating. Now, George de Carvalho, who I've mentioned there, he too, like myself, was a student of John Blacking for his PhD.
Thank you.
Okay.
또 다른 질문 있으십니까?
네, 안녕하세요. 저는 그 한국학중앙연구원에서 석사를 공부 중인 임예림이라고 합니다.
Hello,
네.
반갑습니다.
네, 그래서 저는 한 가지 여쭙고 싶은 게 이제 교수님께서 자료 수집 과정에서 필드워크를 통해서 이제 시청한 자료를 수집하고 또 현지에서 실제로 음악을 배우고 또 그 문화권 내에서 음악의 기능이나 아니면 음악가의 위치를 조사하는 자료로 되게 직접적인 접근을 가장 중요한 작업으로 여기고 있는 것 같았습니다. 그렇다면 이렇게 기록 보존을 위해서 아카이브 구축이나 아니면 녹음, 녹화 관련 기술의 필요성과 관련해서 국가적으로 아니면 대학이나 국제기관, 단체 또는 개인의 차원에서 이렇게 앞으로 어떻게 나아가고 준비되어야 할지 경험이나 그런 방향성에 대해서 말씀을 해주시면 앞으로 저도 공부하는 데 많은 도움이 될 것 같아서 이렇게 질문을 드려봅니다.
Well, that's a long
I'll
question.
translate that.
Yes, please.
Keith, let me just translate it quickly in case there's anyone watching who doesn't speak Korean. So basically just the question is talking about the collection of materials that are acquired. I mean, it's textual materials, various recordings, etc., very much directly sourced materials acquired through fieldwork and so on. The question is what happens with those materials afterwards? So talking about archiving, storing of recordings, texts, and other materials in national, personal, institutional sources. Which of these sources are most appropriate? What kind of things you've been doing in this area? It's something she'd like to know more about.
Okay, right. it's an interesting question. The ethics statements of organizations from Society for Ethnomusicology through to the British Forum of Ethnomusicology are actually starting to question our rights to retain recorded information from people, so interviews, things like that. And we have to be very careful that we apply ethical standards in collecting. 40 years ago, it was rather different. So my fieldwork tapes from the 1980s through to about 1990 are held in the British Library Sound Archive. Not my interviews. The interviews I did with musicians, any tape recordings, I don't have the rights to keep, and so I don't have them anymore. But the things which went to the British Library are primarily recordings of performances and a few lectures and things like that. The British government has actually given some money for those, along with many other ethnomusicology archive materials, to be digitized in the coming months. And I will be going to the British Library quite regularly, I suspect, over the coming months to work out what is in their holdings and what to do with it and how to make sure we have the proper data of what musicians, what people were involved in the recording process. But today, my students would sign an ethics form to say that they have considered what will happen to recordings and to other materials. The materials I collected in North Korea cannot be made publicly available. They cannot be made because there are dangers to anybody you talk to in North Korea or any North Korean you talk to. The same if I'm working with North Korean refugees, and there are some 800 North Korean refugees in Britain today. The recordings have to be kept securely, and the people you work with have the right to say you must destroy the recordings so that they cannot go into any place other than my work. So I think archives need to reflect on the rights of the people we record, the rights of the people we work with. I also think that archives should be, in an ideal world, in the country where the music culture resides. So Korea is a wealthy country and you have great archives, but many places in, say, Siberia, where I've also worked, or Zimbabwe, if we leave resources there, there's no guarantee that they will survive because the funding is not available in those places. So perhaps we still need to have archives in my country for places like Siberia and other parts of the world. But in an ideal world, the archives should be in the country where they belong, the music culture, so in Korea. So I just reiterate that in Korea, your archives are now very good. 40 years ago, not everything was there. And I spent a lot of time in the early 1980s trying to persuade people that they should record folk songs in the countryside before they died out. Now you now know, those of you in South Korea, that something like the MBC big Minyo collection is massive and you have hundreds of hours of recordings. But in the 1980s, you didn't. And the quality of the recordings that were made were often very poor. So Korea has changed, but other countries still have lots of problems concerning archives. I hope that sort of answers your question.
답변 감사합니다.
감사합니다. 네, 조셀린 선생님 질문 부탁드립니다. 네.
네, 감사합니다. 들리세요?
Yes.
네.
So I'm in this question of archives in the 21st century, in the digital era, as we enter the metaverse. I'm wondering about, I mean, as we're sort of decoupling from other countries, or as various countries are decoupling from other countries, and the internet becomes more and more siloed. But at the same time, we really have access to everything in the world if those archives make them available. Does it really matter where things are stored? This is my question. If we're talking about digital archives, and as digital humanities becomes more and more of a topic or more and more of a subject area, how does ethnomusicology sort of join this digital humanities movement? And when we're talking about digital archives, how much does location matter anymore?
Right. I think location may not matter there, but we still have copyright legislation. And the copyright legislation from Britain or from the EU will still restrict what you can get copies of from the archives in Europe, in Britain. So there is a sense there within copyright of ownership, and the ownership is not necessarily with the people who own the music. And there are plenty of examples of how that's happened in the recent past and the distant past. Again, many of the commercial recordings which were made of music around the world are not available for people around the world. And some of them are restricted behind paywalls or to particular places. And that's not going to change very quickly unless copyright legislation changes. And actually copyright legislation is becoming more strict. But not all recordings are appropriate to be made available on archives anyway. Think of the Australian Indigenous Aboriginal recording situation, and should recordings of people who have died and passed on be maintained and preserved? They certainly, the Aboriginal culture typically and usually requires that the recordings are not made available publicly. So in different countries we have that. But I also think that if there is an ownership issue, and I don't see the copyright thing being resolved in any adequate way, I think it should be the people from a music culture who decide what should happen ultimately to the recordings. So I still think that in Korea, you should have the recordings that you want, the archive, available for people, rather than Koreans have to come to London or the British Library, whatever the British Library digitizes. Now, part of the issue there is that the British Library has no real need to incorporate all the metadata that you within Korea might want. And again, that's not going to be easy to resolve. So I think that there has to be a place for regional collections and the music culture being the holder of materials.
감사합니다. 네. 혹시 또 질문 있으신가요? 네, 질문이 없으신 것 같아서 이제 오늘 강의를 마무리하겠습니다. 선생님 통역 부탁드릴게요.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
네.
We're finishing the course, the discussion for today, since we don't seem to have any more questions. Thank you very much to everyone for coming.
But please feel free to send me emails and ask questions.
네. 오늘 선생님의 그 감동적인 강연 감사드리고요. 선생님 건강하시고 또 계속 앞으로도 한국 음악에 대한 연구 많이 해주시기 바랍니다.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for tolerating my talk, for listening for an hour and a half, and have a good evening. Thank you very much indeed.
네.
Bye for now.
네. 그리고 여기 참여해 주시는 모든 선생님들께 감사드리고요. 그리고 다음에는 온라인이 아닌 페이스 투 페이스로 반갑게 인사하는 일이 생기기를 꼭 바랍니다. 선생님 통역 부탁드릴게요.
So thank you everyone for taking part today, and we hope that in the future we'll have the chance to meet in person and share more discussion face to face as well. Thank you very much.
감사합니다. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. 네. 하워드 교수님 감사합니다.
이 선생님,
감사합니다.
thank you very much. Okay.
감사합니다.
Bye.
이용식 선생님 감사합니다. 조셀린 선생님 감사합니다. 얀, thank you. 노은아 선생님 감사드려요. 감사합니다. 임랑경 선생님도 감사드려요.